Welcome to everyone who's here, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Claudia Gonzalez, and I'm a Senior Program Coordinator at the International Women's Media Foundation. For those of you who might not know, the Iwmf offers safety training, fellowship, and grant opportunities and awards, all tailored to women journalists. We're dedicated to diversifying the voices, stories, and perspectives in the global news media, and to honoring the contributions of women journalists to press freedom around the world. If you'd like to learn more about the Iwmf's opportunities, I'd encourage you to visit our webpage and to sign up for our newsletter. Today's webinar will also be recorded and uploaded to our website underneath the resources section. I'll be monitoring today's conversation as well as monitoring the chat. We're planning for at least 20 minutes of Q&A today, so if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop them in the chat box at any time, and we'll circle back around to them at the end of the event. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible today. To begin, I'd like to introduce our two incredible panelists. We're joined by Rochaun, who is a multi-hyphenate creative working to amplify Black women's voices in the mainstream dialogue, especially within conversations on health and parenting. Most recently, she has founded the Free Black Motherhood Movement, a way of mothering that asks Black mothers to prioritize self-love and authentic expression in pursuit of the joy-filled lives they deserve. You can read her work in many national and international publications. Dr. Sumi Raghavan is a clinical psychologist at a private psychotherapy practice called Downtown Brooklyn Therapy. She's also an assistant professor of psychology at William Patterson University in New Jersey. Her research focuses on cross-cultural factors in psychology and mental health, and clinically, she has extensive experience working with diverse client populations. So let's begin. Rochaun, can you start us off by sharing a little bit of what it's like to be a journalist of color, specifically a Black woman in the current moment?
I think it's really challenging. It feels like you're trying to juggle a lot of things at once because we're in this pivotal moment in our societal existence where the white world is waking up to the realities of racism. And so for Black writers, there's this interesting space where the same platforms that have been historically used to silence us have began seeking us out in large quantities. And one of the obstacles that comes along with that is the industry has shifted the number of Black writers in some ways, but there hasn't necessarily been a culture shift. And so an example of this is just kind of thinking about the power dynamics between any writer and editor that come to play, but as it relates to Black writers, and I'm sure other writers of color especially, the majority of editors are white, and even larger or similar majority are white women. And a lot of times, the same editors that get to make the decisions between what stories make it and how your story is told don't often have the racial awareness or the racial competency to see the value in our stories. So that same feeling of silencing that we had before when we were blocked out of the industry completely can end up showing up in a more individual way, which can turn out to be more stressful. An example that comes to mind for me, even though to some editors it might be small, is, you know, the acceptance of capitalizing the B in Black. Long before it was acceptable to capitalize, I was doing that, and I had so many editors who would just be like, no, don't do this, don't do this. And I don't think that they understood that when they rejected my capitalization of the B, it felt like they were rejecting my identity. Because there's just so much nuance to the Black American experience, and least I felt that could be done would be the capitalization of that letter. And then one of the other things is that in this particular time where we're studying like anti-Black racism specifically, there's the feeling that editors are seeking us out, but they are not necessarily seeing our perspectives as the expertise and value that they deserve. And so that kind of leaves me in a bit of a conflict, kind of like, well, you're looking for me, but you don't think it's important enough to pay me better. You don't think it's important enough to honor my experience. You're just looking for quotas, is the way it can feel a lot of times.
So along those lines, Rochaun describes the topic as emotionally triggering. Sumi, can you speak to what this might mean and how it's affecting journalists of color to cover personally resonant topics?
Sure. Quick thanks to you guys at Iwmf for giving us this chance to talk about these important topics. Some of you guys may be familiar with the idea of vicarious trauma, and that this is an experience that journalists can have. And what this basically means is that if you are exposed to a trauma in the form of witnessing it, your brain can actually experience some of the same symptoms, like neurologically and physiologically, that might occur if the trauma were directly happening to you. So a clear example in your field is with war correspondents who are not fighting in the trenches, but are often exposed directly to some of the brutalities of war and its aftermath, and are talking to survivors and refugees and are exposed to some of the most distressing details of the event. Research with war correspondents shows us that many of them can experience a lot of the things that the people that are in war experience. They can experience release of stress hormones in their brain. Part of the nervous system that activates the fight or flight response can turn on. And the other piece of it is that those experiences can then remind, and this is the idea of triggering, can remind you of previous experiences of trauma, of fear, of distress. And so this, while we have a lot of research on this in journalists in areas of violence, we are starting to see more and more discussion of how this can happen to journalists of color who are covering racial unrest and experiences of violence and police brutality in their own communities. We know that, journalists in general, and you guys may connect with this in your experience, are exposed to quite a lot in your work. And something may become your beat or your area, in which case you may be, let's say in the United States, you may be the Latinx journalist who is covering family separation over and over and covering ICE raids over and over. You may be the Black journalist who is covering instances of police brutality multiple times over. So there's repeated exposure, and that can increase your risk for developing some serious psychological symptoms. Now, I want to insert some good news in here. And the good news is that despite this exposure, the research also tells us that most of people in general exhibit resilience. Exposure to this trauma alone is not a recipe for post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or anxiety. But we do know that in the presence of certain risk factors, the likelihood of distress is higher. And there are factors that journalists can consider that may increase risk. Early career journalists, for example, may have greater risk. And we also know that in general, in research in the United States particularly, people of color have higher rates of trauma exposure. There's a lot of research about the idea of racial trauma, and that covering topics of relevance and resonance to someone's personal community can be really emotionally activating. So, what I want to do partially is just validate that experience that, to the extent that you are a journalist of color and you are covering these topics and you feel that it is painful and it's unearthing a lot of emotional debris, the science concurs. It is painful, and it's painful in a way that it may not be for someone who had greater distance from the events at hand. But I also want to emphasize that the fact that you may be connected to the material does not make you less suitable for doing the work. In some ways, it may make you more suitable because the intimacy of your knowledge affords you a particular vantage point. What it means from my perspective as a psychologist and a mental health provider is that you just need a toolkit for approaching and managing these situations.
Thank you. So given the existing challenges that Rochaun described and the possibility of vicarious trauma that you've described, it begs the question of how can we support or advise journalists of color who are doing this work? What kinds of things would be in the toolkit?
For me, one of the most important thing has been boundary setting in virtually all aspects of life. And then a secondary thing that's been working for me is working to develop a more stable and intense sense of self-worth, in that realizing that despite the fact that people in the industry might act as though I am covering these topics, but I am not of significance, or my perspectives lack value in these traumatic times, that I know that that's not true. But of course, one of the things that I think about a lot is that can be especially hard for Black and brown writers, because, you know, a lot of times we have like limited access to the opportunities to tell our stories, you know? And so having that limited access comes with this additional pressure of like, you are the one who made it, like you have to speak for us. And it's a disservice to us because it's so stressful, and it's a disservice to the industry at large because, you know, we all have so much nuance and diversity within our experiences. And a lot of times it feels like we're judged at so much of a harder curve. But as far as the boundary setting goes, what's been working for me is I ask myself 3 questions now when I take on work. It's, is the rate worth the work? Because a lot of times these publications, they'll have this like enormous budget and they think they're going to pay us like not $1.50. Hopefully it's not that bad. But they'll think they're going to pay us like $150 or $200 for a reported feature, like about trauma in my community. That's not acceptable. The other question that I ask myself, is it a topic that I enjoy? And then the third question that I ask myself is, will this, it kind of coincides with the first question, will this story have the potential to propel my career forward? And then the last question, I don't remember if I said I had 3 or I had 4, but the last question that I asked myself is, how will it impact my emotional health? Because, you know, with those 4 criteria, if something does 3 out of 4, then a lot of times I'll take it. But if it's anything less than 3 out of 4, then often it's just not worth the stress. And then like a lot of other writers, like I'm raising 2 small children. I have to make sure I have an emotional capacity present to engage and interact with them. I have to make sure that I can interact with my partner. Like there are just so many other factors that have to be juggled in addition to career life. And so kind of the way that I came to these 4 items that I kind of do the checklist of is in June, I took the month off. At first I took the month off because I was trying to be like everyone else who was like, my birthday is a celebration for a whole month. I never really cared about birthdays, but it seemed like a fun opportunity. And during that time, I made the mistake of checking my email. So I was seeing the work pass by. So if you ever do the month off thing, do not check your email. That's something I've learned from experience. But within that experience, it just kind of showed me that my time is invaluable, right? Like it's possible to have this life that I don't have like constant shoulder pain, or I'm not always like the breath has been taken out of my body, or I'm not stressing like, oh no, will this editor obsess about the fact that I forgot a period at the end of this sentence? Like all of these little nitpicky things that I think when editors are under a lot of pressure and just not being aware, they can do to us. Like editors forget, like they can make us feel traumatized in that power dynamic and relationship. And so what's really been working for me, in addition to those 4 steps, is also getting a counselor. I finally have my first Black woman counselor. I always tell people seriously, even though it's kind of messed up, that it took me 10 years to find a counselor I fit with. I have been looking for a counselor since 2010, and I finally have a Black woman. And it's just so amazing to just consider the fact that I don't have to translate my experiences anymore. I don't have to explain why someone brushing off the capital B in a rude way impacted me. I don't have to understand why someone saying, you need to put a link to prove why racism exists can traumatize me. Like, it's just wonderful to have that. And so in addition to having a counselor that's there to support me, I have also developed a wonderful network of writers of color in general and Black women writers in specific that are there to hold me up when these kind of things have gotten unrealistic, because they can wear on you and you'll be really sitting here feeling like you are a terrible writer, you have a problem, or something's wrong with you because of the constant news and story coverage and life are like grinding you to the bone. And there's nothing wrong with us. What is wrong is this capitalism and this obsession with productivity and the lack of regard for the value of like human joy in life. So
thank you. And before you pick it up, Sumi, I also just wanted to note to people who might have come in late that we're going to have at least 20 minutes of Q&A. So I welcome you to drop your questions in the chat at any point as they come up so that we can circle back around to them.
Great. I really appreciated Rochaun's advice to draw boundaries, and so many of the suggestions she offered that are so concrete really map against what we as professionals would advise. I'm not a journalist, but I am a woman of color, and I understand what it is to feel a responsibility to your community, to bear witness to their truth. And by drawing boundaries and taking care of yourself, you can be a better witness, a better truth teller, and a better advocate for your community. I talked about the idea of vicarious trauma, and the thing about it is that it builds slowly. It's a drip, drip, drip. It's unlike the direct experience of a trauma where you can get totally flooded. With vicarious exposure, you can get piece by piece built up, and in that way, it can be very sneaky. So really checking in with your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors can give you a sense if something's off. So I had talked about the idea of a toolkit, and I want to give you a few specific tools that may be helpful for your toolkit. And the first is a technique called Before, During, After, or BDA. And it's actually kind of discussed a lot by a journalist, Kate McMahon, who consults with the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a great resource. They've got a website, and they have a lot of resources there about what it is to experience trauma through your work as a journalist. And what the BDA technique is basically kind of a set of steps you can go through at each stage in your process to take care of yourself. So the B for before going on an assignment. If you anticipate that you're going to be in a situation where there may be some trauma, some exposure, do a check-in with yourself physically and mentally. Do you see any personal warning signs? Look out first for things in your body biologically. Are you sleep deprived? Have you been eating? Do you feel increased stress levels because of maybe things happening in your life that are not work related? And if you do that check-in with yourself and you say, you know what, my baseline's not where I think I want it to be to feel ready to take on this assignment, it's okay to say no. It really is. But if the self-assessment leads you to say, like, I think I'm good, I'm in the zone, I got this, what I advise is for you to do a technique called coping ahead. And this is where you sort of imagine, project forward, what will the assignment be like? I'm going to walk in, I'm going to talk to this person, what emotions are going to come up for me, what challenges might I experience, and really visualize yourself handling it well. Visualize yourself being calm, making the decisions you need to make, and completing the task. And this is all before you go in. And then during the assignment, focus on the task at hand. Check in with your thoughts and feelings, but really focus on completing the task. Practice kind of keeping your breath under control and pace yourself. For longer assignments where you may be at a particular place for more than one day, sort of interviewing subjects, think about how you can build in breaks. One thing I want to mention is that I know a lot of the trauma exposure that can happen with journalists doesn't just happen in physical situations, but many journalists work with really challenging user-generated content, sitting at your desks exposed to images and pieces of writing that are really hard to see and read. And taking breaks in those processes is really important. A friend of mine kind of tells a story about journalists that she knows in a newsroom that every hour they do a 5-minute plank challenge. So that's a nice way to kind of get into your body and get out of this space of thinking about the task. You may or may not be familiar with the Pomodoro Technique when you're writing or researching, where you set maybe a 25-minute timer, you focus without distraction. When that timer goes off, you give yourself a break. And that may feel a little counterintuitive. Maybe something in you says, I got to grind for the next 4 hours and get this done. But in reality, you'll be more effective if you insert those small breaks. In fact, there was a research study in a London newsroom looking at journalists that were working with some pretty difficult user-generated content. And what they found was that the journalists reported the most effective breaks they took was when they went online and looked at baby animal pictures, or when they did online shoe shopping. And those two specific things really reduce their stress levels. So it's really in the service of pacing, and that's during the task. And then the A for after the assignment, establish some safety for yourself. And what does that mean? It means get to an environment that is comforting or familiar. Utilize your resources. Eat, rest, exercise, watch some TV, utilize your social supports, focus on regrouping and recouping afterwards. The way to get through these assignments is not to place pressure on yourself to process all of your thoughts and feelings while you're in the moment, while you're interviewing people, while you're working with this content and engaging with this intense material. You really want to focus on simply completing the task. Once the assignment is done, then you focus on recentering and you talk about what it meant and how it felt. And, I also echo a lot of what Rochaun said about working with a counselor, seeking out social supports. Those are really invaluable sources of support that can really uplift and maintain you through some of these long sprints.
Thank you. Before we open up to Q&A, I just wanted to see if either of you had some additional thoughts you wanted to end with.
One of the last things that I want to say is just kind of the importance of having grace with yourself, right? Like in all areas, having grace in the mistakes you make within content, having grace within when you have to take an assignment because money is so tight that you would have normally rejected it, but it's not possible because, as we know, wage discrimination and all of these other things are like so real, right? So like have grace with yourself while dealing with real life, and also remembering that like we don't have to just cover trauma and sadness. Like it's fine for a writer of color to cover 3 puppies that you want to go adopt from the animal shelter. Like it's totally fine for us to write stories that are like, one time I spent $1,000 on a getaway just for myself. Like don't allow the industry to tell you that our existence has to be like smashed into suffering. And something that I did today, I started it a week ago, but I added something new recently, is I have this board up on my wall. And so I put a Toni Morrison quote that I heard from someone recently, and it says, I get angry about things and I go to work. Because I think that's a lot of us, like we get frustrated and we start working. And I also put a note up here for myself that says, stop trying to work before biological processes. And for me, that was extremely important because I'm that person who will wake up at 6 in the morning and I'll come straight to the computer and I will sit down and I will get to work. So I had to make reminders. Make sure you go to the restroom. Make sure you drink water. Make sure you eat. And so I have that baseline of items. And then I have what I call the bonus section. Like, did you stretch today? Did you water your plants today? Because hobbies have been just saving my life these days. Did you find out what the kids are going to eat? Because they're going to bother you for the rest of the day and you got to be able to deal with it. Like there's this, that's not on there, but there's this long list of things. But I think set up reminders to have grace with yourself and give yourself the love and dignity that you deserve.
Yeah. Hey, I really love that thought. And I think it's I think it's really important because often in my field, we focus on where things go wrong and how people are struggling. But I want to reiterate that the most common trajectory after trauma exposure is resilience. People do bounce back. And even if you're working through incredibly difficult tasks at work and you feel distressed and you're struggling, you can bounce back. One of the greatest predictors of resilience is social support. So community building and mentorship, and we know especially how valuable that is for people of color, the kind of community building and mentorship that an organization like Iwmf can support can be really, really valuable. So in addition to sort of nurturing your hobbies, practicing self-compassion, build connections to people that support you and remind yourself that you exist independent of your work, you exist independent of your pain, you exist independent of your history and the histories of your people, and you exist independent of the struggles of any particular moment. There is a you to nurture and support.
Thank you to both of you for all of that wonderful input and advice. We have ample time for Q&A, so
Great.
For all of our attendees, this is the time to take advantage of our wonderful panelists here, so please do send your questions in. I have one question so far, which I will pose now. As a freelancer, you don't want to be seen as difficult or unreliable because you turn down stories to prevent yourself from being overwhelmed. How do you convey that to the editor without losing that writing gig?
I think, of course, the route you take for that is going to depend on your relationship to the editor. So more established, one thing that's a part of my freelancing strategy is I aim to develop sustainable long-term relationships. I'm sure that's probably like most freelancers' dreams. So that's not necessarily unique. But for those editors that I have the long-term relationships with, a lot of times I like just tell them directly, I can't do it right now. One of the goals of my life is to be incredibly transparent with my mental health state. And because I experience depressive and anxiety episodes, like I don't have the capacity to put myself in stressful situations that don't yield a return. But with the newer editors, I had one that I spoke to recently, and she was like, I have 2 assignments to check in with you to see if you're interested in either of them. Both of them were coronavirus related. And I had to be honest. And I was like, you know, I am coronavirused out. I understand that there's a level of privilege in being more established as a writer that makes that possible for me that it may not be for people who are a little bit earlier in the process. But one thing that my counselor has told me is you can never go wrong by betting on yourself. And although you might deal with that editor being like, oh my gosh, like they didn't want this assignment, I'll never talk to them again, because I imagine worst case scenario every time. They're gonna write me on a wall of blacklisted people and I'll never hear from them again. That's where my brain eyes goes. But if they respond that way, then you don't want that kind of person directing you in a project. Again, I understand that we have all of these financial obligations, but your mental health is worth it. And I think I found that most editors understand because they're stressed too. And a lot of them are also writers.
Yeah, I think that that's a good piece of advice regarding remembering the humanity of your editors as well there. And while I'm not a journalist, 2 things that I can speak to regarding this is Rochaun talked about the sort of worst case scenario place in your head and the fear that if I say no to this, I will be perceived this way and my future prospects will be limited. And it's valuable to, acknowledge, okay, this is a fear I have. This is an anxiety I have, but that doesn't make it a fact. And the worst case scenario is not usually the most likely scenario. And I think we have to honor the fear, but also kind of check in about, what can I do to sort of ensure that I have future work? And some of that can just be framing things in terms of what you can do. So this project won't work, but I'll be ready on this date for a next assignment, that kind of thing.
Wonderful. We definitely have some more questions coming in regarding advice to different scenarios. My next one would be, how can you avoid the feeling of guilt? Guilt of not doing enough, taking longer than expected to finish a story, wanting to cover too many stories at the same time, etc. Would you like to, you want to start with that one about covering the stories?
I feel like so the short answer to that is when you figure out, let me know. Because it is definitely a work in progress for me. Also, I think that it's just the nature of experiencing life as a marginalized person to feel like you have to do everything and be everything for everyone. And while our intentions are good, when we do that, again, y'all gonna hear me reference my counselor so much. When I tell y'all I've been doing some work, I've been doing some work. One of the things that we talked about that I feel is somewhat similar to that example is I have a tendency to try to guess how someone's gonna respond to something that I did. So it's like, okay, if I don't do this work and I feel guilty less because I don't want to do it and more because of how I anticipate they'll respond. But what she had to explain to me was by trying to predict how someone else is going to react to a scenario, I'm doing myself a disservice, and I'm also doing them a disservice by trying to be a future predictor and not giving them the space to express whatever those feelings are. And so I do understand that it is a slightly different example, but for me as an individual, the guilt, the wanting to write every story, there was this one time, something I find funny, y'all, is that for a good 4 months, if you typed in Black women in Google, my face came up. I have no idea why, but on the little sidebar, my friends and I had the longest time cracking up with it. And because that's me, I am that person. No, somebody has to represent Black women. And if it's not there, then it's like, you failed. And I take it really personally. But again, just through doing self-work, I've just had to realize that as people and as producing individuals, we live on a continuum of creation, right? And so if we could do everything, why does a generation need to come after us? Why did a generation need to come before us? We exist so we can contribute, so the next set can contribute, so the next set can contribute, and hopefully we're not still gonna be talking about racism that many generations later, good God. But aside from that, you can't do it all, so don't even, it's easier said than done, and it takes a lot of journaling and reflection, but don't even try.
Yeah, you can't do it all. And I really appreciated what you said about how, particularly the experience of being coming from a marginalized community, you feel the pressure to represent your people, you feel the pressure to reflect the best of your people, and you feel a deep fear that anything you don't do will be misattributed to failures of character, and that you are expected to demonstrate a level of excellence, and that naturally translates to guilt. Guilt is a demon. It is destructive. It is difficult. And one way to maybe reframe guilt in your head is that it often comes with this idea of what we should do, right? It's a should statement. It's an insistence. You should, have produced X number of stories. You should have earned X amount of money. You should be at this place. You should be doing this thing. And it can be really overwhelming when you are confronted with that. A very famous psychologist once said, stop shoulding on yourself. This idea that those statements really serve not to motivate you, but to beat you down. And one piece of advice I can offer psychologically is to interrogate some of those questions. All of you here are sharp critical thinkers, and you know how to interrogate things. And so this idea of well, I should have earned this much money. Says who? Based on what? Based on what standards? Based on what set of expectations? When we go down this path of shoulds, we run the risk of creating more and more distance from what actually resonates with who we are and what we value. And we we become totally beholden to a relatively arbitrary external set of demands. And that doesn't mean that we should have no expectations of ourselves and there are no shoulds, but we have to find a balance where we recognize that there is a tipping point where the guilt becomes totally counterproductive and ineffective. And I reiterate a point I made earlier, that you can do a better job of your work if you take care of yourself.
Thank you. We have a lot of great questions coming in. My next one would be, how do you suggest is the best way to respond to an editor or manager who limits you to covering stereotypical, uninspired, offensive stories about communities of color? What would be your plan for rising above that?
I think that's really hard, right? I think it would depend on the so for example, is that a contract-based assignment? Like, are you in a long-term relationship? Is this a one-off project that you just continue to freelance with them? And forgive me if I missed if that was described, but I think probably one of the best things to do is expressing it. I think that expressing it first is always the gateway to everything, even if you think it's not going to be well received, because that takes the burden off of the way you feel. Because I know when I feel like I've intentionally avoided conflict, I can be really like uncomfortable and stressed. And it's like, dang it, I should have done this. But what I really did was just go in the corner and cry. Like, no, that's not.
Stop shitting on yourself.
Well, yes, I forgot. But yes, so being transparent and open about the way that makes you feel. And so at that point, you'll come to two outcomes, right? Well, technically there's always a third, but we'll go with two. So one outcome is you'll express it and they'll say, oh my gosh, I had no idea that I was basically tokenizing you, right? And then situations can get better. The other scenario is they can completely reject your perspective. And then that third one that I said I was going to ignore, but I lied, is that they might decide, okay, well, I don't agree with you, but what do you want to do different? So I would suggest like reaching out and being like, hey, this is how I'm responding to what you're suggesting. Here are some other things that I would like to cover. And of course, suggesting whether or not there are other things you would like to cover would be heavily dependent on whether you want to preserve that relationship with that platform or that editor, because all writers can tell you, like, there are some platforms and editors that are not for us. And their intentions are to just, commodify our identities and put us in these narrow little boxes. So should you feel that that's the sort of circumstance that you're in, I think it would be beneficial to just kind of let them know, like, hey, I appreciate the opportunity to have developed a relationship with you, but for where I am in my life right now, I think I'm going to step away. Of course, that's easier said than done, but for me, I think that would be how I would handle that situation.
I think the only thing I would add to that is just to validate the idea that you have a right to advocate for yourself in those moments. The feelings that you have are real. The experience that you're having is real. And to check in with yourself about, what stops me? What stops me from speaking out? What stops me from speaking up? What am I scared of? Am I scared that I will lose this relationship or lose this job? And kind of thinking about what are the ways I can empower myself to not operate from a place of anxiety in that way, which again is easier said than done. But I think it's really important to recognize that many of us, people of color and people from marginalized backgrounds, we have been socialized over many generations and decades across the world to diminish our own perspectives in relation to a white perspective as neutral. And in doing that, we, do ourselves a little bit of a disservice, because the first voice we hear is the one that tells us that what we're thinking isn't right. And I invite you to question that and to practice that questioning in the service of your empowerment.
Fantastic. What kinds, so I know that, Rochaun, that you mentioned the importance of community as well in your support network. What kinds of communities aside from Iwmf have you found useful, or do you recommend for freelancers looking for support?
In my early stages, I spent a lot of times, so this example is going to be gender dependent. It particularly is there to support gender nonconforming and women identified writers. So if you don't identify with either of those groups, I apologize. This may not be the best example for you. But in my early stages, I was involved in the Binders group on Facebook. That was a great source of community. It's a lot of information, but with time, I found that that information also came with an exposure to individuals that haven't done the same, basically the same problems I was trying to avoid with the editors was present within the community. A lot of people that haven't done the work of racial awareness and understanding. So although that was the starting point, with time, I have just kind of taken some of those pockets of relationships that I've developed there. Like, for example, if there's a writer that you just like on Twitter, or if there's a writer whose Instagram you love, or one that turned out to be really helpful for me recently, is I went to a writer's workshop. And so from that writer's workshop, like, we got put in groups, and my group is the best. Like, we were just the best. And so now I have 6 new writers that I'm in community with, and we do study sessions together, and we do timed meetups, and I just love all of them. And so one of the most simple ways I would say is, if you like somebody, reach out. Like, it sounds so like elementary, but we've all been in that experience where it's like, that person is so cool, I want to be their friend. Like, it happens in the writer's world, and overwhelmingly, writers are awkward people. We're we're just weird. A lot of us are. Every once in a while, you'll find like a cool writer, but most of us are awkward. And awkward people, like, we're very receptive to when people reach out to us. So just like you're looking for community, chances are the other writers that you're passing by, they're like, oh, I wish I had a friend. And you could be that friend that they're wishing for. So send them a message.
Yeah, I love that. I would also add, if those of you who are listening to, if any of you are editors or in senior positions where you have a little more stability and security, really sort of reaching out to early career journalists of color, or helping to build informal mentorship networks. This is a really common thing in many, many organizations where, you know, a senior person is paired with a junior person, or just checking in with somebody really informally if you know that they're doing the kind of work that you would imagine would be difficult for them. It doesn't, you know, the networks can be formal or informal. It's really about reaching out to another person and saying, if you are feeling this, I'm here. I hear you. And kind of building like a check-in buddy. And it can be someone who doesn't even work where you work or do exactly what you do, but who has some understanding of your experience as a person of color in a world that does not necessarily reflect or validate your experience.
Thank you. Wow, I'm excited to see all the great questions rolling in. We have about 15 minutes left, so let's see how many we can get to today. My next question is, I report on issues of violence against women and lack of transparency in politics, and I have been the victim of attacks on social networks. As a freelancer, I face the consequences of my posts without support. How can I not feel so frustrated when I'm being attacked and I have no support?
So my response to that is gonna be pretty quick, and then I'm gonna pass it to the mental health expert. I guess like what sticks out to me in that is, you know, you said, how can I feel less frustrated? No, feel frustrated. Feel frustrated AF, because you deserve to be frustrated. And as a person who's truth telling, like you should not be beaten and badgered down for that experience. So in addition to reaching out to your fellow writers and just kind of following, there are actually a good amount of examples on Twitter of writers of all genders who have kind of retold their experiences with being trolled and traumatized online. So probably one of the best pieces of advice that I have is looking for some of those other individuals and connecting. And I think there's a lot of power in that, in you being able to potentially start the resource that may not exist yet. And now I'll pass it to the experts.
I actually would have led with exactly what you said, Rochaun, which is that when I hear you say, how can I feel less frustrated? I hear you taking the blame as if your feelings are the problem rather than the behavior of those who are being abusive and harassing you. And the problem is not that you're having a reaction, you're having a very reasonable reaction to a very unreasonable experience. And you should honor and, authenticate and validate your feelings as this is not okay. It's not okay for you to be, kind of treated this way. And I think that finding support is the best, advice I would give in that situation. And also practicing kind of tools to you can acknowledge and validate the frustration because the behaviors that you're experiencing are unacceptable. They're objectively hurtful, but they are not a comment on your value or worth. And they are not indications that you shouldn't be doing this work. And I think reminding yourself of the importance of what you're doing and creating meaning for yourself in the work that you do, such that these people cannot take that away from you. And then finding support, like Rochaun said, from others. Many, I'm sure, as she said, there are many that have been in that position who are being shamed and disrespected online by those who are uncomfortable with the truths they are telling. And so finding others that you can connect with and get support from about that, but really don't start from a position of how can I not feel? Really start from a position of how can I feel empowered to keep doing what I'm doing despite this?
And for that question, I also need to plug the Iwmf's resources for digital security. We do have an online harassment initiative that's providing resources for women and non-binary journalists. We do one-on-one consultations for folks who are facing attacks. We're also recently launched a course called Know Your Trolls. It's available for free online and it's linked on our website. So that can also be a resource for just learning more about trolling behavior and how to best respond or protect yourself. My next question. With recent news events, I find myself interviewing many traumatized individuals, and I think part of the vicarious trauma we experience as journalists has to do with not knowing what to say to people in crisis. Do you have any advice, re the Bda technique, for these sensitive situations?
Yeah, such an important question when you yourself feel like you're in the position of a therapist or a mental health counselor, because you may be one of the first people they talk to in a particular situation about their thoughts and feelings. And one thing I would say is, some of this, it is not your area of expertise, and it is not, it's not incumbent on you to provide therapy for them. But I think that things that can be done are maybe your instinctive responses towards empathy, validation, and support, and directing someone towards resources, letting them know that they can and should go to a counselor if they feel able to do that, letting them know that the feelings that they have are normal, telling them that you feel for them and you're sorry and that you see their pain. And those are very human responses to help someone feel supported. It's quite a lot to take on the role of helping someone work through their trauma in the moment if that's not your area of training. So I actually would say, in the vein of drawing boundaries, to not take that on, but rather to lean into sort of your instinctive compassion and empathy, and maybe think about, if these are the assignments that you're on, think about finding support in your area of work to come up with resources, maybe pooling together with others who are doing similar work, of how you can support sources that you're interviewing that are repeatedly bringing up these things. And when I say all this, I don't say that to sort of invalidate the desire to help. I think that pull is very strong when you're talking to someone who is in pain and emotional and saying, this is happening, oh my God, like, what do I do? But your role in that situation is not the same as that of a therapist. So I would definitely invite you to sort of to protect yourself from taking that on in a healthy way.
And one quick thing that I would like to add to that, there are two circumstances in particular that I can kind of recall being in that circumstance. And one, I think the one that hurt me the most is I was doing a story on just kind of like the lifelong trauma of mothers who lost their children to police violence. And so I don't have to describe how painful having those conversations were, but one of the things that was really important for me in that circumstance was to stay connected with those individuals, not for the purpose of future stories, but to let them know that with so many negative perceptions about what journalists are doing, to let them know, like, I see you as a human, right? Like, I don't see you as a story. I see you as a person in pain, and I want to amplify and support you in whatever ways possible.
Fantastic. All right. We have a question. The participant said, thank you all for being here today. How do you feel about Black reporters sharing our personal experiences on social media? For example, sharing Black Lives Matter posts. It's turned political in some sense, and there's opposition with Black Lives Matter. However, I was born Black, that's not a choice, whereas policing is a choice. Some people see posting about Black Lives Matter as being biased and taking sides. And as a reporter, I don't want to come off biased. However, I can't act like these topics don't affect me emotionally. I feel like I've hit a wall overthinking whether I can speak out on social media to express my solidarity with the Black community.
Oh, we had that conversation not that long ago, and it gets into that talk about like the concept of objectivity within journalism, right?
I was thinking about that you and I had talked about that question.
Yes, we had that almost exact question. And so it's just like this idea that whiteness is only capable of neutrality. Like at the core of it, that's basically what it is, even if it's said different ways. And so I think one thing, of course, it gets into is what we already discussed of how our stories are enhanced by our direct experiences. And also, I feel that it gets into, again, I'll watch my language just in case, but forget this idea of objectivity, right? Like, just forget it. Like, to expect you to be this, I don't know, inhuman, non-person who is like, your people are being slain in the streets and dehumanized regularly, and you to be like, whew, don't know what that Black Lives Matter stuff is about, sure aren't interested in that. Like, no, they might as well have your name on it, right? It might, like for me, when I see Black Lives Matter posts, it might as well say, Every's life matters, because like that's what I read. Like I take that stuff very personally. And so any individual who expects you to be able to deny your existence within a particular community and how these issues direct you specifically because they put your life at risk isn't someone that you even need to listen to. Again, as a person with anxiety, I understand those things are easier said than done. I'm that person who on Twitter, I have it, if you're not, what is it? If I don't follow you or if you don't follow me, I don't even get your mentions because I don't have time for trauma. Like I have to put up safe gates to make sure that I'm not out here processing more stuff in addition to the fears that I already have. So I would say forget those people. It's unrealistic for you to deny your lived experience because that's what makes you special.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I had asked Rochaun about this when we were prepping and talking about the webinar. And I had said, you know, is there this culture in journalism that you need to be objective and therefore removed from the experience. And, she hit the nail on the head, which is that there is this assumption that whiteness is neutral and that every other experience comes with a bias. Whiteness is not neutral either. It is a perspective. It is a particular perspective. And as Rochaun said, you should not be expected to deny your lived experience. And speaking from that as a psychologist, there is also sort of a broader culture of separating emotion and reason as if they are two different things. That feelings make us irrational and thoughts make us rational. And that is the product of a particular social structure that emphasizes, concrete productivity and particular ways of analyzing and framing information that themselves have a bias. And what the research shows us is that reason and emotion work together, and that in fact, emotion informs rational decision-making in many situations. So to the extent that your fear is, I'm biased and I'm too emotional, I would say, your connection to the topic allows you to see things in a nuanced way and to see things that those that are distant cannot and do not see. And the emotional experience you have allows you to understand the power and the impact of these topics in a different way. Your job is not to cut out the feelings and the bias. Your job is to take care of those feelings so that you can continue to do the job well.
I'll take on one more big question in our last few minutes here. We received a couple questions about relationships with managers, editors, or coworkers. One of them said, when I have to confront an editor or even just stand up to someone in a position of power over me, I often feel choked / tears welling up. I am not sad, I am angry, but I just want to stay calm and make my point without it becoming a meltdown. Do you have any advice on this? I've spoken to many women who have told me they have similar reactions spring up when they just want to be taken seriously. Similarly, another participant mentioned that they worry about the stereotype of the angry Black woman when she has to push back on a white editor's decision. And what's the advice on being firm, but also dispelling that stereotype?
I think as it relates to me, we have kind of like we touched on a moment ago, like we have emotions, right? It is completely reasonable when your, again, lived experience, whichever lived experience we were referencing at the time, is being denied, to be angry, to have your eyes well up with tears, to do all of these other things. So this might be the wrong part of the question, but again, for me, with this obsession that I have right now with authentic emotional expression, like it's not my job to pretend to be calm, right? Like it might, something that I've been reading a lot lately is this idea of like niceness, right? And like it goes very closely hand in hand with professionalism, and it goes, and so there's a lot of like buzz terms that are telling us, no, you need to behave the way that is socially and societally acceptable within this moment. And I think when we kind of take a step back, both with talking about the stereotype of the angry Black woman and with talking about like the idea of being the emotional Black woman, because I can be both of those depending on the day. Like thinking of those things, you hear that underlayer of you're not being white enough. And I know people who like I know people are, oh, she always takes it there. But like realistically, I think that's at the core of a lot of the things that we discuss. You are not fitting within the cultural context that is acceptable within this moment. And I want to like validate those feelings and like let you know that it's okay if you don't fit into someone else's cultural context, because we have our own cultural context. And so if you're worried about being seen as tearful or angry, you might be angry. And if you are angry, you deserve to express that anger. And so something that works for me when I'm really particularly shaky, if I have to say it in an email and rehearse it with my mom or one of my coworkers, or the folks I co-work with, like all of those kind of things, like I'll make sure that I go for direct but not rude. So I'll make sure, like, how does this sound through this rehearsal? And if it sounds honest and if it's not rude, like if they detect anger, then to me, that's their part, right? Like, you know, I'm mad because of what you did. It's not my weight to carry.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to that, excellent advice that Rochaun is giving is that in addition to these concrete ideas of practicing and preparing, one of the things I like to ask myself is, what would a white dude say? And why can't I do that? And I think that we can make it as a joke, but the point here is that ideas about how we should and should not behave are based upon ideas of propriety that are dictated by a particular culture and society and a particular set of values that are not necessarily universal. And the expectation that we don't express emotion, that we don't advocate for ourselves, that we accept what we are given. This is part of the socialization of women in general, women of color particularly. And so when we find our own voices in our head saying, don't do that, you're going to get misperceived. It really comes from this idea that the only way to advocate for yourself and the only way to present is according to this very specific set of behavioral expectations. And I would say that concrete advice to practice ahead of time can be very helpful, but also some of where the emotion can come from in the moment is kind of the buildup of not honoring those feelings in most of our lived and daily life. And so to the extent that you can honor your experiences day to day and embrace and connect with those emotions and authenticate them as valid and real, it actually can give you greater control over how you express with clarity your needs and preferences in those situations.
Thank you. I know we're just over time here. I'm just going to end on a lighter note with this quicker question of, when you get a chance to get away from work, what have you done in the past few months for yourself to process and recharge?
My favorite. So I have been jewelry making. I have, like, anyone who like knows me pretty well will know, like, I started a garden in the backyard, and it's been like life-saving, not just because it gives me access to like good food, but also because it gives me something to nurture in the way I expect to nurture myself, and I've been neglecting to do. And so I've been like eating squash all the time out the backyard because it blesses me with a lot of squash, and trying to get as much sun as possible, and also understanding or holding myself to the standard of just giving me more free time, because editors will have you rush to do something and they won't respond for like 3 days. So we don't need to rush either. Like, don't put that stress on yourself. Get a garden and start making jewelry. That's what I would do. That's what I did.
Yeah, so I, in addition to, like Rochaun said, I'm also a mother of a 4-year-old, and I'm also 7.5 months pregnant. So this entire pandemic period, I have been pregnant, I've been with my son, I've been teaching, I've been doing research, I've been seeing patients via Zoom. And part of what I've had to remind myself is like, oh my God, I'm doing a lot. And so the times that I want to do nothing are fine. And I am going to lean into that. And it doesn't make me lazy. And it doesn't mean that I don't feel like, it's like, no, I'm doing enough. I'm good. Like, I don't need to check off any more boxes. And I keep telling myself that. So I'm a really social person by nature. And so a lot of what I've been doing is Zoom calls with friends and masked walks with friends, now that it feels a little safer to walk outside, and really, really kind of leaning into my social network. But what I advise a lot of people to do, especially under these weird new circumstances of COVID, is, routines for yourself, self-care, and I don't mean self-care in sort of a corny way of like get a manicure. I mean like actually the things that make you feel good, and really sort of exercise, activity, things that get you out of a particular space and into another one. Like all of those things can have a really powerful effect. I remember the first time I took a walk with a friend after a few months of social distancing, I felt so rejuvenated by it. And I was like, wow, I love people because I had missed it so much. But then I've sort of made a point of like, and scheduling these walks with a couple of friends, you know, once a week, where I just remind myself that my connections still exist.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to both of our wonderful panelists. I learned so much today and I really appreciate your time. Thank you all for those who were able to attend today. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to every single question, but this was great for us to help frame what kind of questions you all might want to have answered in the future. And we hope to offer more events like this in the future as well. So thank you all so much. And I hope you have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you guys. Thank you for joining us. All the best.